Curious Lloyd.
History books can be full of terrible things, like warfare, genocide and the plague. But every now and then, history's horror stories are so over the top, they have to be left out of the history books and classrooms entirely. A Prime Minister revealed that he was eaten by his constituents. Prime Minister Johan de Witt of Holland had the worst year in political history. It was 1672, and the Dutch had unexpectedly found themselves at war with nearly all of their neighbours. So obviously, large parts of the country were rather effortlessly conquered, and Johan fell from the public favour because of it. Over the course of 2 months, he was badly wounded by an assassin. He forced to resign, and saw his brother Cornelius arrested, tortured, and sentenced to exile on trumped-up charges. Johan tried to visit his brother one last time, but the soldiers guarding the men were mysteriously ordered away. And then, the pair were attacked by an angry mob. The brothers were shot repeatedly, stripped naked, and hung by their feet from scaffold. Then their genitals were cut off, their bodies were sliced open, and their hearts and guts were pulled out, and then people began eating them. According to one account, Cornelius was still alive when the mob cut him open and began feasting on his innards. If it's any consolation, it's not. But Johan did get a few remembrance statues built centuries after, but probably as a sort of a national "our bad on the rage" cannibalism. The nuns who cut their noses off. You know the expression, cut off one's nose to spite one's face? You could say that's a weird phrase, and probably ask, where did it come from? Well, one terrifying theory is that it originated with some especially hardcore nuns. The story goes that the Scottish Abbey of St. Ebba the Younger was attacked by Vikings sometime around 870. Rather than see herself and her fellow nuns raped, Ebba grabbed a razor and cut off her nose and upper lip, then wallowed in a resulting torrent of blood. The other nuns, filled with admiration at this admirable deed, followed her example, and it worked. The Vikings were so horrified that they refused to approach the nuns, allowing them to retain their beliefs, although it was more of a moral victory than anything else, as the Vikings returned and then promptly burnt down the abbey. The deadly Madagascar vomit trials. In 19th century Madagascar, justice was abandoned in favour of a challenge straight out of the fear factor. The Malagasy people of the island often determined guilt through a method called tangina, which was a favourite of Queen Ranavalova I. The practice involved swallowing a poison made from the nut of a tangina tree, along with 3 pieces of chicken skin. If you successfully vomited all 3 pieces of skin, you were declared innocent, but if you failed, or just flat out died, then you were guilty. The average citizen's belief of the divine righteousness of tangina was so strong that most people preferred it over an eyewitness. And even those who failed the test largely accepted their fate as the will of some higher power. The trial was also popular among elites. It was used as a legal instrument to systematically deprive potential rivals of their wealth. So, making someone eat nut poison was basically their version of rich people suing each other into oblivion. But you can't put those fatalities aside. Despite often being used for minor infractions, tangina had a fatality rate in the range of 33 to 55%. And it was so popular during Ranavalona's reign that between 1828 and 1861, it killed an average of 3,000 people a year, except in 1838, when it killed as many as 100,000, or 20% of the population. Some of the world's legal systems has its flaws, but at least you don't have to eat poisoned Nutella every time you hit a Mercedes. The serial killer whose murder weapon was President Taft's pistol. Karl had the makings of a real-life Coen Brothers villain. After being brutally beaten and raped all throughout his youth, he went on a one-man rampage across America. This included vandalism, theft, arson, rape, and murder. He even wanted to start a war between America and Great Britain. The man had a dream, a terrifying one, but a dream nonetheless. In 1920, Panzram burgled the home of former President William Howard Taft. Believe it or not, he had a bone to pick with Taft. He had been sentenced to 3 years at Fort Leavenworth military prison for enlisting in the army, but refusing to work while Taft was Secretary of War. Panzram was the sort of guy who could see that as Taft's fault. Anyway, Karl made off with cash and thousands of dollars worth of jewelry belonging to the former First Lady and Taft's Colt .45 pistol. Panzram used the profits from his crime to buy a boat, then lured sailors aboard with the promise of work, before getting them drunk, raping them, and then murdering them with Taft's gun. He then weighed their bodies down and threw them overboard. He killed at least 10 people this way, part of the 21 murders he claimed to commit. Panzram was eventually caught and arrested for robbing Taft's house. While in prison, he beat someone to death and was executed for it, but not before he wrote some of the most depressing memoirs in human history. As further punishment, he was later portrayed by James Woods in a very unfortunate movie. The countless men who drowned in mud. World War I often takes a backseat to its gritty sequel, but it was nonetheless a total horror show of trench warfare, mustard gas, and existential poetry, and that's merely scratching the surface. For example, the Battle of Passchendaele saw some of the heaviest rain Europe had endured in 30 years. It absolutely poured for a whole week, while artillery destroyed canals and drainage ditches all over the swampland, so the field itself turned into a muddy disaster. If you didn't know already, you can drown in mud, a lot like quicksand. One battalion lost 16 men to mud alone. One soldier wrote about that unique feeling you get when you successfully navigate the mud, only to realise you were stepping on corpses the whole time. A Canadian and a German soldier were found drowned together while locked in struggle. But here's one of the survivors' first-hand account. A khaki-clad leg, 3 heads in a row, the rest of the body submerged, giving one the idea that they had used their last ounce of strength to keep their heads above the rising water. In another miniature pond, a hand still gripping a rifle is all that is visible, while its next-door neighbour is occupied by a steel helmet and half a head, the eyes staring icily at the green slime which floats on the surface, almost at their level. You just can't think on what those men actually went through. So before you start complaining on how bad your life is, take a minute and think on how lucky we really are and what those soldiers did for us, so that we could live a rich and healthy life.